a little bit hard for me to say exactly what my thoughts are on the Vietnam War, just because I honestly think that if the Vietnam War didn't happen, I don't think I would be here, to be honest. And that's kind of weird to think about. Where it's like my my both of my parents met here in America, so they didn't meet back in Vietnam, and it's different than other Vietnamese parents who might have met in Vietnam and then escaped together. Because my when my dad moved back to California, my mom also moved in the same neighborhood as him. They lived probably about maybe like a block or two apart. And I think it was because of that distance that helped my mom and dad meet. And so it's weird when I look back in a retrospect, because I did ask my mom this question of, had the Vietnam War not happened, what would have happened to us? And she said, well, most likely my family and I would all be back in Vietnam. But also, I realized that if that was the case, then my mom would have never met my dad. I wouldn't be here. So it's hard, because it's like, I don't really know what would have happened if the war didn't exist at all. I honestly don't think I or my siblings would be here. But it's hard because a lot of Vietnamese people, including myself, have a lot of pride in our country. And it does hurt in the way that there's so much poverty within our country, and there's so many times where we don't necessarily feel safe going back because of the way that the government is. There are times when I went back to Vietnam and my parents would warn us, don't say certain things, or don't let other people hear you say, like, okay, my siblings and I were singing the like not the current Vietnam national anthem, but like the the old Vietnam national anthem of the Democratic Republic, because we were forced to sing it in school. And so my siblings and I were singing it as a joke, and my mom like immediately reprimanded me, and she was like, you can't sing that here, because if anyone hears that, they're gonna throw you in jail. And the thing is, that's actually like a common occurrence in Vietnam. If you say anything against the government, you will just disappear like that. So you have to be very, very aware of what you're saying. But also, I think for a lot of Vietnamese people, we want to see a unified Vietnam, but we also want to see a Vietnam that's very prosperous. And I think that wouldn't be possible underneath the communist regime. It has gotten better in the last couple of years, but there's a lot of times where I wish that it wasn't communist and that it was a lot more prosperous. And I think for a lot of Vietnamese people, honestly, like for me, example, I look at South Korea, for example, who had a similar conflict between the communist and democratic side, and the way that South Korea was able to flourish compared to Vietnam, where we all became one. And it's hard because it's like, I still have family in Vietnam, and for their standards, they're considered very rich, but over here, they're still considered very poor. And so it's hard, because I think there's a lot of trauma caused for all Vietnamese affected by the war. And I don't necessarily have a positive opinion of what happened during the war, but what I can say is that I'm very proud of the sacrifices that my parents have taken to make something out of such a terrible situation. Yeah, I think there's definitely a different mindset with newer wave of Vietnamese immigrants coming in. It's not the same sort of mindset of, oh, we just came from war and we came from nothing, and now we just gotta start from ground up. A lot of times when I meet Vietnamese immigrants, especially young students, most of the time they come here to pursue a better education. And so it is a little bit different. Sometimes it's a little bit of a culture shock, because I actually work at a Vietnamese restaurant, and there's two chefs in the back who immigrated from the south of Vietnam, but they came from the more rural areas. And so it was a big shock to me when they told me things such as, like, I can't read, or I dropped out at ninth grade. And it's so weird for me, because their way of thinking is so different. And it's it's kind of crazy, because like because like at least like here, very, at least like in my opinion, like very easy to get an education. And so to not be able to read, especially like when these chefs are maybe like 30, 40 years old and there's like writing all over, like it's still something that's very hard for me to fathom. The reason why I talked about the new waves of immigrants is that one thing that I like to talk about within the Asian community is that Asians are considered the model minority because we're one of these so-called groups that earns the highest. But that's only half true because the word Asian encompasses so many different groups, such as Filipinos, Koreans, Indians, and not each group has the same experience immigrating or assimilating here. Because even though Asian Americans are one of the highest earning groups, we also have the biggest economic disparities within our communities because Indians, Japanese, Chinese people are known to earn, a higher wage compared to the rest of the groups in America. But groups such as Vietnamese, Hmong people, they're known to experience higher poverty rates. I think part of that is due to the difference in our immigration waves, because there's a difference between someone who's immigrating here for a better education because it shows that their family had the financial means for them to send them to a different country and to be able to pay for a tuition that's probably a lot higher than usual compared to Vietnamese refugees who came here out of necessity with nothing. And I think due to a lot of Vietnamese people immigrating from the war, I think that's why we experience a higher poverty rate than other Asian Americans.
What would
I think the biggest differences between Vietnamese refugees and their American born children is the culture that they have. And I say that because for a lot of Vietnamese kids, including myself, we have a hard time understanding the way our parents are the way that they are. I think part of it comes from the difference in culture, but also I think it's also a difference in mentality. I think for the longest time, I've always wondered why my parents weren't necessarily as nurturing or as open or as communicative as a lot of my other friends' parents. But I think when I actually look back in retrospect, it's all about a frame of reference because for me, my parents provided me with food, shelter, and education. That's probably more than their parents were able to afford. And so it's a little bit hard to kind of bridge the gap because a lot of, I guess, differences that I have with my mom comes with our culture. And the more difficult part is that there's a lot of Vietnamese parents that have a lot of untapped trauma from the war that they bring into their own lives now, that they carry on to their children. And it's things such as like a sort of like scarcity mindset or the idea that, you can't necessarily talk about your feelings because for a lot of Vietnamese parents, well, they went through a whole war. And so things such as like, I'm struggling in school, I don't necessarily have the best friend group, or things that are like, oh, well, I'm having difficulty now, seem like very minute compared to going through an entire war. And so for a lot of Vietnamese kids, from who I've talked to, have a lot of difficulty expressing that to their parents because it's not on the same, it doesn't seem as if it's in the same way. But I do wish that a lot of Vietnamese refugees were able to recognize that it is a different time now and that their children are going through just different circumstances and that they were more open to their children going through certain struggles. I think also vice versa for a lot of Vietnamese children to recognize why their parents are the way that they are. Because for the longest time, I never really understood why my mom was so militant on me until she told me about her grandfather, who, as I mentioned before, was in the military, and she was just as strict on her as she was on me. I think it's just a sign of the generational trauma that happens within the Vietnamese community that I think is getting better as younger Vietnamese people are able to recognize these patterns and stop it. I've been wanting to visit Vietnam for such a long time. It's just that because of COVID, it just completely messed up any type of travel whatsoever. For me, I would love to be able to go to Vietnam because it is changing at such a rapid rate. The amount of westernization that's happened, which is a good thing, our economy is still building up. But I also feel as if it's not the same Vietnam as I visited when I was maybe 5 or 6. And so for me, I just want to be able to get closer to my culture, especially because I think for a lot of people that go back to their home country for the first time, it's just this instinctive feeling that I'm where I'm supposed to belong. And for me, it's always been difficult to keep close to my culture, especially because there's so many more things associated with tradition that I just don't necessarily have access to compared to being here in California. And so for me, it's very important to be able to go back and just immerse myself again in my culture and in my